She thought she had devised the perfect revenge, a plan so carefully woven with lies, intimidation, and sabotage that her landlord would be left powerless and humiliated. Neighbors whispered, rules bent, and the property seemed to crumble under her calculated defiance. For a while it looked like she might actually win, until one small detail shattered everything. What happens when a tenant who believes she's untouchable finally faces the consequences of her own scheme? Keep watching, because this downfall is unlike anything you've seen before. Ethan Wells lived a life built on structure. He wasn't flashy, nor was he careless. He was steady, dependable, and meticulous in the way he carried himself. In a neighborhood ruled by rules, he fit right in. The streets were lined with manicured hedges and carefully painted shutters, each house looking like a mirror image of the next. For some, the rigid order of the HOA community felt suffocating. For Ethan, it was peace. He had purchased his modest two-story home years earlier, at a time when the housing market still felt forgiving. His property wasn't grand, but it was his. Attached to the side was a small rental unit he had renovated with his own hands. That unit had become an extra stream of income, the piece of stability he relied on to cover maintenance costs and long-term goals. Ethan wasn't a landlord chasing big profits. He was someone who understood responsibility and saw his rental as a partnership. Provide a decent space, treat tenants fairly, and in return receive steady rent. Simple, every morning began the same. Ethan brewed his coffee, walked out onto his porch and listened to the hum of sprinklers switching on in neighboring yards. The sun would rise over the cul-de-sac, casting long shadows across the driveways, where cars sat neatly parked in perfect rows. The HOA's influence was visible everywhere. Fresh paint on fences, trimmed lawns, trash cans lined up in identical positions. To some it felt sterile, like living inside a postcard. But for Ethan it was comfort, a reminder that chaos was kept outside the gates. He balanced his responsibilities with quiet pride. His days at work, he managed logistics for a mid-sized shipping company, were predictable just the way he liked them. Evenings were spent tending to his small vegetable garden, tightening a loose hinge, or painting over the occasional scuff on his property. He was a man who found peace in order, a sense of security in the predictable rhythms of maintenance and planning. Neighbors often nodded approvingly when they passed his driveway, admiring how clean and well-kept everything looked. Ethan rarely missed a detail. The rental unit had always been a blessing. Previous tenants came and went without trouble. Young professionals saving for a home, couples passing through between jobs, even a retired veteran who paid early every month and treated the space with respect. Ethan knew there were horror stories about landlords and tenants, but he had never lived them. For him, it had been routine. Contracts signed, rent collected, property respected. But life has a way of testing the foundations we think are unshakable. The first hint came not from Ethan's property, but from the HOA itself. Notices began arriving with unusual frequency, citing small infractions he had never been accused of before. A trash can supposedly left too close to the curb. A patch of lawn that looked, they claimed, slightly yellowed. A garden ornament out of compliance. Each letter came with a warning tone, and each fine felt sharper than the last. Ethan brushed them off at first. Mistakes happened. Maybe the board had grown stricter, or perhaps someone had made a clerical error. He paid the smaller fines quickly, not wanting to cause trouble, but he noticed a shift in the tone of his neighbors. Conversations felt shorter, their eyes lingering on him longer than before, as though whispers were passing behind closed doors. He couldn't place it, but something was different. Inside his home, life continued as it always had. He kept his records neatly filed, photographs of his property before and after every maintenance stored in folders. He had built his system for accountability, for order, never imagining how much he would one day need it. Still, the unease crept in, an invisible crack in the walls of his peace. The community itself fed the tension. Cures thrive on appearances, and appearances are fragile. Ethan knew that if someone wanted to tarnish his reputation, all it would take was a few whispers, a few staged complaints. He had seen it happen to others. A man down the street once had a feud over a shed that was 2 inches taller than guidelines allowed. The board had hounded him until he tore it down, leaving a patch of barren ground where pride once stood. Ethan had always sympathized but thought himself safe. He followed the rules. He played by the book. There was no reason to target him, and yet as the weeks passed, the feeling that something or someone was pushing against him grew stronger. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. The HOA letters kept arriving, and late at night, Ethan would hear noises from across the street. The slam of a car door, the muffled laughter of someone who didn't care who was listening. His neighborhood, once a place of quiet predictability, was beginning to feel like a stage where unseen forces were setting him up for a performance he hadn't agreed to join. He didn't know it yet, but the stability he valued most was about to be dismantled piece by piece, and the person responsible was closer than he realized. The first real crack appeared the morning Ethan discovered a letter, taped not to his door, but directly to the glass of the rental unit. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was a complaint written in scrawled handwriting, unsigned, accusing him of neglecting tenant rights and creating unsafe conditions. Ethan read the note twice, disbelief tightening in his chest. The rental was immaculate, freshly painted, smoke detectors checked, even new appliances installed the month prior. Whoever had written this wasn't telling the truth. His tenant, Cassandra Hale, stood outside smoking when Ethan pulled the note down. She was in her early 40s, sharp-faced with eyes that rarely softened, always watching as if calculating the next move. When she first applied to rent the unit, she had seemed polished, well-spoken, and professional. A single woman working from home as a consultant, she claimed she needed a quiet space for her work. Ethan had seen no red flags then, but now, with her eyes narrowing at him as he held the note, he felt the first tug of unease. At first, Cassandra's behavior was subtle. She let her trash overflow until the bags sat piled beside the cans, attracting the attention of passing board members. She left her car parked slightly crooked across the driveway line, a technical violation, but one that stood out in a neighborhood obsessed with symmetry. Each time Ethan addressed the matter politely, documenting everything, but Cassandra's expression never changed. It was as if she welcomed the conflict. Within weeks, the anonymous complaints escalated. Ethan received letters accusing him of harassment, noise disturbances, and improper leasing procedures. One even claimed he had falsified rental agreements. He sat at his desk late into the night, surrounded by files, receipts, and photographs, each one proving his innocence. But the HOA didn't see his evidence. They only saw the stack of accusations. And with each letter, the fines grew larger, the warnings harsher. It was no longer just paperwork. Cassandra began staging confrontations. Neighbors whispered that they had seen her crying dramatically in her yard, claiming Ethan had threatened her. Others heard raised voices through thin walls, voices that Ethan knew were hers, yelling accusations into silence. She was crafting a narrative, one carefully designed to turn the neighborhood against him. And it was working. Ethan noticed the change in his neighbors' eyes. People who once smiled now crossed the street when he approached. Cars slowed in, front of his driveway, drivers glancing his way as though assessing whether the rumors could be true. The quiet harmony of the cul-de-sac was unraveling, and Ethan had become its villain. The harassment didn't stop at whispers. Cassandra filed a formal complaint with the HOA, claiming Ethan had violated tenant laws by entering her unit without notice, an outright lie. Ethan had never set foot inside since she moved in. But when the board summoned him to a meeting, he was met with a wall of suspicion. Their questions dripped with judgment. Why hadn't he handled the issue sooner? Why was his tenant so distressed? Why did the complaints keep piling up? Ethan presented his evidence, dated photos, signed lease agreements, receipts, but the board's expressions remained unreadable. He left the meeting with the distinct impression that the truth mattered less than appearances, and in a community built on appearances, perception was power. Cassandra understood that perfectly. Soon, Ethan found himself the target of late-night harassment. His porch light was shattered one evening, glass scattered across the steps. Spray paint marked the side of his fence with the word "abuser" in dripping red letters. Each time he cleaned up the damage, Cassandra watched from her window, a faint smirk on her lips. He called the police, filed reports, and documented everything. But without witnesses, the incidents were logged as vandalism with no suspect. The psychological toll was relentless. Ethan's once predictable days were consumed with dread. He checked his mailbox with a knot in his stomach, bracing for the next fine or notice. He stopped tending his garden, the tomatoes left to rot on the vine. He avoided walking the neighborhood, unwilling to feel the weight of his neighbor's silent judgment. The place that had once felt like sanctuary now pressed in like a cage. But Cassandra wasn't finished. She stopped paying rent. Month after month, Ethan sent polite reminders, then formal notices, each one ignored. When he initiated the legal eviction process, Cassandra retaliated by filing a counterclaim accusing him of harassment and unsafe living conditions. Suddenly, Ethan wasn't just facing HOA pressure. He was staring down the barrel of a legal battle. The court date loomed, but the harassment intensified. One morning, Ethan awoke to find dozens of flyers taped around the neighborhood, each one accusing him of being a slumlord and predator landlord. The flyers used his full name, his address, even his photograph. Children rode past on bicycles, laughing as they pointed to the signs. Parents pulled their kids away when Ethan tried to explain. Cassandra had turned him into a pariah. Nights grew longer. Sleep became elusive. Ethan's once steady hands shook when he tried to hold his morning coffee. He replayed every decision he had made, every document he had signed, trying to find the crack Cassandra had exploited. But there was no mistake, only manipulation. And yet, despite the pressure, Ethan refused to fold. He organized his files meticulously, building a fortress of evidence. Every receipt, every inspection, every communication was logged and time-stamped. He studied tenant law late into the night, highlighting statutes and case studies. If Cassandra wanted a war, he would not walk into battle unarmed. Still, the closer the court date came, the more unhinged Cassandra's behavior became. She staged loud arguments outside, yelling accusations into the empty air, ensuring passing neighbors could hear. She placed broken furniture in the shared driveway, blocking Ethan's car, daring him to touch it so she could claim harassment again. She even mailed herself fake threat letters and presented them to the HOA as proof of Ethan's supposed abuse. Each move was designed to push him further into isolation. Each trick was meant to make him crack. And then came the letter that changed everything. It wasn't from the HOA or Cassandra, it was from a lawyer. Cassandra had filed a lawsuit accusing Ethan of discrimination, harassment, and intentional emotional distress. The claims were wild, unprovable lies, but the weight of a formal lawsuit made Ethan's knees buckle. His friends urged him to settle, to avoid the stress and financial ruin. But Ethan refused. Settling would mean surrender. Settling would mean admitting guilt for crimes he hadn't committed. The rising storm had reached its peak. Ethan stood on his porch one night, staring across the street at Cassandra's darkened window, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth after rain. His neighborhood was silent, every house dark, every streetlight humming faintly. He realized this was no longer just a tenant dispute. It was a war for reputation, for sanity, for survival, and the next battlefield would be the courtroom. As he turned back into his house, he felt it, the faint shift in his chest between fear and resolve. He would not be broken, not by Cassandra, not by the HOA, not by the lies. The stage was set for the confrontation that would decide everything. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy sky, gray clouds rolling in like a warning. Ethan stood in the courthouse parking lot, clutching his folder of evidence so tightly that the edges curled beneath his fingers. His heart hammered as if it were trying to break free from his chest, but beneath the nerves was a sharp clarity. Months of harassment, humiliation, and manipulation had brought him here. This was the battlefield Cassandra had chosen, and today he would face her head-on. Inside, the courtroom was sterile, walls pale and unyielding, the air buzzing faintly from flickering fluorescent lights. The benches creaked under the shifting weight of curious neighbors who had come to watch. Some were loyal to Cassandra, convinced by her fabricated tales. Others whispered doubts but had come for the spectacle. The HOA board members sat stiffly in a row, their expressions unreadable masks. And then Cassandra entered. She swept into the courtroom in a crisp navy suit, hair pulled tightly back, carrying a binder stacked with papers. Her expression was calculated, sorrow painted across her features, indignation burning behind her eyes. To the casual observer, she looked like the wronged party, a tenant bravely seeking justice against an oppressive landlord. She even dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue as she sat down, a performance polished to perfection. Ethan's stomach turned, but he forced himself to remain still. She had thrived on his reactions for months. Today she would get nothing from him. The case began with Cassandra's attorney presenting her claims. The words flowed smoothly, each accusation delivered like a blade. Harassment, illegal entry, unsafe conditions, discrimination, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Photographs were projected, grainy, manipulated images showing damage in the rental unit. Emails were read aloud, but Ethan recognized them instantly as forgeries. Cassandra had woven a story so intricate that for a moment, even Ethan felt himself drowning in it. Gasps rippled through the audience when Cassandra broke down in staged sobs, describing nights where she claimed Ethan had stalked her outside the window, or moments when she had feared for her life because of his alleged threats. The judge remained impassive, jotting notes, eyes occasionally flicking toward Ethan, as though weighing his silence against Cassandra's theatrics. When it was Ethan's turn, his legs felt like stone as he rose. But he opened his folder with steady hands, the months of preparation carrying him forward. He began calmly, laying out the timeline of events. Receipts, inspection reports, dated photographs, all meticulously organized, each one disproving a specific claim. Cassandra's photographs of damage were countered with move-in inspection reports signed by her. The alleged harassment emails were revealed as forgeries, proven by metadata, showing they had been created on her own laptop. The claims of unsafe conditions crumbled under inspection certificates from the city, stamped and signed by licensed officials. But the most devastating blow came when Ethan produced the HOA's own records. Each anonymous complaint Cassandra had filed was linked back to her, traced through timestamps, handwriting analysis, and even security footage of her dropping envelopes into the HOA's mailbox. The courtroom shifted. The murmurs grew louder, neighbors exchanging startled glances. Board members leaned forward, unease spreading across their faces as Ethan's evidence stacked higher, more damning by the minute. Cassandra shifted in her seat, her mask cracking ever so slightly. Still, she wasn't finished. When given the chance to rebut, Cassandra lashed out, her voice rising as she accused Ethan of manipulation, of weaponizing the system against her. Her polished veneer gave way to raw desperation. She shouted over Ethan's evidence, insisting everyone was conspiring against her, that the HOA, the neighbors, even the court itself were blind to the truth. But in her fury she made a mistake. She slipped, mentioning details from the forged emails that only the creator could have known. The judge's eyes snapped to her, sharp and questioning. Cassandra faltered, tried to recover, but the damage was done. The courtroom sensed it, the turning point, the unraveling of the careful web she had spun. Ethan stood silent, letting her words condemn her. His restraint, his patience, contrasted with her frantic unraveling. For the first time in months he felt the balance shift. The climax came when Ethan's attorney submitted the final piece of evidence. Bank records showing that Cassandra had not paid rent for months, despite continuing to live in the property. Combined with the fraudulent complaints, the vandalism reports, and the staged harassment, the narrative she had built collapsed under its own weight. The judge called for order as the room buzzed with shock. Neighbors stared at Cassandra in disbelief, whispers spreading like wildfire. The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, realizing they had been manipulated just as much as Ethan. Cassandra's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she clutched her binder, but no more lies would save her now. She had built her entire case on deceit, and it had just been torn apart piece by piece, exposed under the sterile glow of the courtroom lights. The ruling was swift but devastating. The eviction was approved. Cassandra was ordered to pay back rent, damages, and legal fees. And in a stinging rebuke, the judge referred her case for potential charges of fraud and perjury. The gavel struck, the sound echoing through the silent room like the closing of a door. For Ethan, it was the sound of release. He sat down slowly, exhaustion washing over him. Around him neighbors whispered, their once skeptical glances softening into something like respect, or at least regret. The HOA board members avoided his eyes, their own culpability etched in the lines of their faces. But his gaze stayed fixed on Cassandra. She sat frozen, her performance shattered, her expression a mix of rage and disbelief. For months she had orchestrated every move, convinced she could destroy him. But in the end, it was her own arrogance that had undone her. And as court officers moved to escort her out, Cassandra's mask slipped entirely, revealing not a victim, but the face of someone who had finally lost control. Ethan exhaled, the first breath of freedom he'd felt in months. The battle was over, but its scars would linger. The climax had come, and with it the downfall of Cassandra's twisted game. The courtroom emptied slowly, neighbors leaving in hushed clusters, their whispers trailing in the air like smoke. Ethan sat still for a long moment, hands pressed flat against the bench, grounding himself in the reality of what had just happened. For months he had lived under the weight of suspicion, harassment, and lies, each day feeling like a battle for his sanity. And now, with one ruling, the storm had broken, but the aftermath was just beginning. Cassandra was escorted out of the courtroom by officers, her face pale and lips pressed into a thin line. She no longer carried herself with the poised confidence she once wielded like a weapon. Her walk was stiff, almost mechanical, the performance drained from her body. The neighbors who had believed her lies turned their eyes away, ashamed of their misplaced loyalty. For the first time since she had arrived in the neighborhood, Cassandra looked small, stripped of power, stripped of credibility. Ethan gathered his folders, each document now more than just proof. They were his shield, the tools that had preserved him. As he walked out into the gray afternoon, the clouds seemed to thin, shafts of sunlight piercing through, as though the world itself had been holding its breath and was now exhaling relief. News of the verdict spread through the community like wildfire. Within days, the HOA was flooded with questions from residents demanding explanations. How had the board allowed Cassandra's lies to spiral into fines, harassment, and public humiliation for an innocent landlord? Why had they been so quick to accept her words without question? The once unshakable board members found themselves cornered, their credibility damaged. Some resigned quietly, unable to face the growing distrust. Others clung to their positions, but their authority was weakened, their once iron grip reduced to fragile glass. For Ethan, the shift was palpable. Neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid him now approached hesitantly, offering half smiles, nods of acknowledgement, or muttered apologies. Trust was not rebuilt overnight, but the tide had turned. Where once his driveway had been a place of humiliation, it now became a quiet symbol of vindication. Cassandra's fall, however, was far steeper. The court's ruling had not only ordered her eviction and repayment of damages, but also left her vulnerable to further consequences. The referral for fraud and perjury opened the door to criminal charges. Word spread quickly that investigators were reviewing her falsified documents and fabricated evidence. The same theatrics that once won her sympathy now painted her as deceitful and manipulative in the eyes of the law. Her reputation outside the neighborhood shattered just as thoroughly. The flyers she had once plastered to destroy Ethan's name now circled back to haunt her, evidence of her malice and vindictiveness. Employers, friends, and even distant acquaintances pulled away, unwilling to associate with someone exposed so publicly for deceit. The mask she had worn for so long had cracked beyond repair, leaving only the bitter truth beneath. The eviction itself was a scene etched into the memory of the community. On the morning the deputies arrived, neighbors stood behind curtains or clustered at a distance, watching as Cassandra's belongings were carried out piece by piece. The furniture she had once used as props in her petty games now sat on the curb in plain sight, a monument to her downfall. Broken dishes, torn papers, and the hollow remains of her life spilled into the open, stripped of the secrecy she had cloaked herself in. Cassandra stood by, her face drawn tight with rage and humiliation, but there was no sympathy left to gather. She had burned every bridge, poisoned every well, and now the consequences stood before her in stark clarity. She had tried to destroy another's life, but in the end it was her own that lay in ruins. For Ethan, watching from his porch, the moment was bittersweet. He felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, only a deep sense of relief. The weight that had pressed on his chest for months finally lifted, leaving behind scars but also a renewed strength. He had survived. He had endured. And he had won. Yet the impact reached further than just one man and one tenant. The HOA, once emboldened by its unchecked authority, was forced to confront its own failures. New policies were drafted, requiring greater transparency, stricter evidence requirements for complaints and protections for homeowners against baseless accusations. The board that had once wielded power like a weapon now faced oversight, its influence restrained by the very community it had once dominated. The neighbors, too, changed. The ordeal had forced them to reckon with their own complicity, the ease with which they had accepted rumors, the willingness to condemn without question. Some sought out Ethan directly, offering apologies or support, small gestures of reconciliation. Others avoided him still, embarrassed by their own behavior. But the fabric of the neighborhood, once poisoned by whispers and suspicion, began slowly to mend. Ethan himself emerged stronger, though changed. The garden he had abandoned bloomed once more as he returned to the quiet rituals of daily life, tending the soil with steady hands. The tomatoes ripened on the vine again, a quiet testament to resilience. The driveway that had once been blocked with Cassandra's petty displays now stood clear, a space of peace reclaimed. But the greatest impact was internal. Ethan had faced the full weight of injustice, the crushing force of lies, and the suffocating grip of isolation. He had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unscathed but unbroken. The experience left him more guarded, more cautious of those who wore masks of charm and respectability. Yet it also left him more resolute, more determined never to allow injustice to go unchallenged again. Cassandra, on the other hand, faded from the neighborhood story like a shadow at dusk. Her attempts to appeal were dismissed, her pleas for sympathy ignored. The last anyone saw of her, she was loading the remnants of her life into a battered car, driving away without a backward glance. No applause, no audience, only silence and the cold consequence of her own actions. The neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, the echoes of conflict fading but never entirely gone. The memory of Cassandra's games lingered as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly lies can spread, how fragile trust can be, and how easily power can be abused. Yet it also served as a reminder of resilience, of truth's ability to withstand even the most vicious attacks. For Ethan, the final chapter closed not with fireworks, but with quiet strength. On a late summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, he sat on his porch and breathed deeply. The world felt lighter, steadier, and though the scars of the battle remained, they no longer weighed him down. Justice had been served. Cassandra's revenge plan, designed to destroy him, had backfired spectacularly, leaving her exposed, humiliated, and gone. Ethan had endured the storm and emerged into calm. And though the memory of the ordeal would never fully vanish, it became something else, a story of resilience, of truth prevailing over deceit, of strength forged in the fires of injustice. The lesson lingered, not just for Ethan, but for anyone who heard his story. Lies may spread quickly, manipulation may thrive for a time, but in the end, truth stands taller. And those who seek to ruin others often find themselves crushed by the weight of their own schemes. So the question remains, when faced with injustice, would you endure the storm or would you fight back? And that's how Cassandra's elaborate revenge scheme came crashing down, leaving her exposed, humiliated, and ultimately defeated by her own lies. Ethan endured months of harassment and injustice, but in the end, truth and persistence won out. If this story had you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think Cassandra got what she deserved, or did the court go too easy on her? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe with notifications on, so you never miss the next unbelievable story of power, pettiness, and ultimate karma. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the end, lies always collapse under the weight of truth. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.